The contrails streaked white against the frozen February sky over northern Germany as Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler rolled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into position behind what he assumed would be an easy kill. Another American escort fighter limping home after the long flight from England, his squadron had been feasting on these vulnerable machines for months, shooting them down as they ran out of fuel trying to shepherd bombers deep into Reich territory. But as Stiegler closed to firing range on this particular aircraft, something felt different. The sleek fighter ahead of him didn't have the familiar profile of a P-47 Thunderbolt or the stubby fuselage of a P-38 Lightning. This was something new, something his intelligence briefings had mentioned only in passing. A North American P-51 Mustang. The Luftwaffe pilots had dismissed these aircraft as mediocre performers, nothing to worry about compared to their superior German fighters. What Stiegler didn't know in that moment, what none of the Luftwaffe High Command had fully grasped yet, was that he was looking at the aircraft that would systematically destroy German air superiority over the next 15 months. The fighter he was about to engage wasn't the underpowered disappointment German intelligence had described. It was something entirely different, something impossible. By March 1944, just weeks after that encounter, approximately 175 of these transformed Mustangs would appear over Berlin for the first time in aviation history. They would fly escort missions that military planners had calculated were mathematically impossible. And in doing so, they would turn the tide of the air war over Europe in a way that no single weapon system had achieved before. This is the story of how one aircraft went from being dismissed as a low-altitude disappointment to becoming the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back. And it all came down to one critical change that transformed everything about what this fighter could do. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the P-51 Mustang's role in the European air war. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about how dramatically this aircraft changed between 1942 and 1944. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. These stories take serious research to get the technical details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. To understand the magnitude of what the P-51 Mustang achieved, you need to understand the crisis facing American bomber crews in late 1943. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to a strategy that many considered suicidal. They believed they could defeat Nazi Germany through strategic bombing, striking deep into enemy territory to destroy the industrial capacity that kept the Wehrmacht fighting. This wasn't just a tactical decision. It was a fundamental bet on a new theory of warfare. While the Germans had perfected tactical air power, using their Luftwaffe as mobile artillery to support ground forces, the Americans and British championed strategic bombing. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Don't just fight the enemy's armies, destroy their ability to wage war by obliterating factories, oil refineries, transportation networks, and the industrial infrastructure that fed military operations. But there was a massive, deadly problem with this strategy. Getting bombers deep into Germany meant flying through hundreds of miles of enemy-controlled airspace defended by the most sophisticated air defense network ever created. The Luftwaffe had thousands of fighters positioned at airfields across occupied Europe, all dedicated to one mission: destroying American bombers before they could reach their targets. In the summer of 1941, when the North American Aviation Company first delivered 2 prototype Mustangs designated XP-51 to the United States Army Air Forces, nobody imagined these aircraft would become the answer to this crisis. In fact, the USAAF didn't even place an immediate order. The initial flight tests showed the aircraft had potential, but it wasn't revolutionary enough to demand urgent procurement. It took intervention from General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, to keep 55 Mustangs from a British order for evaluation purposes. Even then, most of these early aircraft were converted into F-6A photo reconnaissance planes. They were assigned to the 154th and 111th Observation Squadrons and sent to North Africa in the spring of 1943 to take pictures, not fight. The reason for this lukewarm reception became clear once pilots started flying the early P-51A model in combat conditions. These aircraft were powered by Allison V-1710 engines, the same power plants used in early P-40 Warhawks and P-38 Lightnings. And while the Allison engine performed beautifully at low altitudes, it had a critical weakness that made it nearly useless for the mission American bomber crews desperately needed. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine's performance fell off dramatically. By 20,000 feet, where B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators conducted their bombing runs through the heaviest flak and fighter opposition, the P-51A became sluggish and underpowered. It simply couldn't maintain the speed and maneuverability necessary to dogfight with German interceptors at those altitudes. So the early Mustangs were relegated to theaters where air combat happened closer to the ground. The China-Burma-India theater received most of the P-51A production run, where the aircraft performed admirably in low-altitude fighter-bomber roles. In April 1942, the Army Air Forces even ordered a dedicated ground attack version called the A-36 Apache, fitted with dive brakes and bomb racks for precision strikes. The A-36 entered combat in June 1943, seeing action across North Africa, Italy, and India. Pilots loved the aircraft's handling characteristics and its ability to take punishment from ground fire. But nobody was calling it a war-winning weapon. It was just another competent fighter bomber doing important but unglamorous work, far from the decisive battles being fought in the skies over Germany. Meanwhile, American bomber crews were dying in horrifying numbers over German-controlled territory. Without fighter escorts capable of staying with them all the way to targets deep inside Germany, bomber formations faced relentless attacks from Luftwaffe interceptors. The fighters that could escort them, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, simply didn't have the range to accompany bombers beyond the German border before having to turn back to refuel. This created what bomber crews called the Gap of Death, a zone deep inside Germany where bombers flew without fighter protection, vulnerable to coordinated attacks by German fighters that had perfected tactics specifically designed to break up bomber formations and shoot down as many aircraft as possible before they could drop their bombs and escape. The statistics were brutal. On missions to heavily defended targets like ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt or aircraft plants at Regensburg, bomber losses sometimes exceeded 20%. That meant 1 in 5 aircraft that took off from England didn't come home. 1 in 5 crews, 10 men per bomber, either killed, captured, or missing. At those loss rates, the mathematical certainty was that bomber crews wouldn't survive their required 25 mission combat tours. Something had to change. The strategic bombing campaign that American military planners had bet the war on was failing because bombers couldn't survive the journey to their targets. What the Army Air Forces needed was a fighter that could fly as far as the bombers, fight effectively at altitudes above 20,000 feet, and still have enough fuel to dogfight with German interceptors before escorting the surviving bombers safely home. Every expert in aviation engineering said such an aircraft was impossible. The physics simply didn't work. Fighters needed to be small and light to be maneuverable. Long range required massive fuel tanks that added weight and drag. High altitude performance demanded supercharged engines that consumed fuel at prodigious rates. You couldn't optimize for all 3 characteristics simultaneously. Every design was a compromise, except that in the fall of 1942, engineers working on both sides of the Atlantic were about to prove the experts wrong. And they were going to do it by taking that mediocre P-51A Mustang and making one critical change that would transform it into something unprecedented in aviation history. The breakthrough came from an unlikely partnership between American designers and British engine manufacturers. Rolls-Royce had spent years developing the Merlin engine, the same power plant that had made the Supermarine Spitfire one of the most effective fighters in the Battle of Britain. The Merlin was a masterpiece of engineering, a liquid-cooled V-12 that maintained excellent performance at high altitudes thanks to its advanced two-stage supercharger. Someone, and history isn't entirely clear who deserves the credit, had the idea of mating the Merlin engine to the P-51 Mustang airframe. It seemed like a long shot. The aircraft had been designed around the Allison engine. Fitting a completely different power plant would require extensive modifications to engine mounts, cooling systems, propeller configurations, and weight distribution. But when test pilots finally got behind the controls of the prototype Merlin-powered Mustang in late 1942, they discovered something extraordinary. One test aircraft in the United States reached 441 miles per hour at 29,800 feet. That was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51A at that altitude. It wasn't just an improvement, it was a transformation. The Merlin engine didn't just give the Mustang more speed at high altitude. It fundamentally changed what the aircraft could do. The combination of the Mustang's exceptionally clean aerodynamic design and the Merlin's powerful high-altitude performance created a fighter that could cruise at 350 miles per hour at 25,000 feet while sipping fuel at rates that gave it unprecedented range. North American aviation immediately pivoted into mass production of the Merlin-powered variants, designated P-51B when built at the Inglewood, California plant, and P-51C when manufactured in Dallas, Texas. The changes were more than just the engine swap. Engineers redesigned the entire engine installation, relocated fuel tanks, modified the cooling system, and optimized dozens of smaller components. By December 1943, the first P-51B and P-51C Mustangs arrived in England and were assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, which proudly called themselves the Pioneers. These pilots and ground crews knew they were flying something special. The aircraft's performance numbers were impressive on paper, but nobody yet understood the strategic implications of what this fighter could achieve. The German Luftwaffe intelligence services had received reports about the new American fighter, but their assessment was dismissive. Yes, the Americans had fitted a British engine to their mediocre, low-altitude fighter. So what? German fighters like the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the latest Messerschmitt Bf-109G models were proven combat veterans with experienced pilots who had been fighting since 1939. How much difference could one new fighter type really make? They were about to find out. In early 1944, the United States Army Air Forces launched Operation Point Blank, a systematic campaign to destroy Germany's capacity to wage war through strategic bombing. The operation had two primary objectives. First, cripple German fighter production by bombing aircraft factories and related industrial facilities. Second, destroy the Luftwaffe itself by forcing German fighters into battle, where American numerical superiority could grind them down through attrition. The key to both objectives was the P-51 Mustang. With external drop tanks, the Merlin-powered Mustang could fly escort missions to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,100 miles. That meant American bomber formations would have fighter protection all the way to their targets and all the way home. There would be no more gap of death where bombers flew defenseless through the heart of German airspace. On March 6, 1944, the strategic situation in the European air war changed forever. United States heavy bombers struck Berlin for the first time with full fighter escort coverage. Approximately 175 P-51 Mustangs accompanied the bomber stream all the way to the German capital and back, engaging in running dogfights with Luftwaffe interceptors across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was immediate and devastating. For years, they had enjoyed a significant tactical advantage. They knew exactly when American bombers would be vulnerable, could calculate precisely when escort fighters would have to turn back for fuel, and could mass their forces for coordinated attacks on defenseless bomber formations. Now that advantage was gone. The Mustangs stayed with the bombers all the way to target and all the way home. And they weren't just passively defending the bomber stream. Mustang pilots had authorization to leave the bombers when German fighters were spotted, chase them down, and destroy them before they could organize attacks. The hunters had become the hunted. German pilots quickly learned that engaging a P-51 Mustang at high altitude was nearly suicidal. The American fighter had superior speed, excellent acceleration, and remarkable maneuverability for an aircraft with such long range. The Mustang could outturn most German fighters above 20,000 feet. It could outdive everything the Luftwaffe had. And it could pursue retreating German aircraft back to their own airfields and strafe them during landing when they were most vulnerable. But the transformation wasn't complete yet. Even as the P-51B and P-51C models were proving themselves over Germany in early 1944, North American aviation was preparing to introduce the ultimate development of the Mustang design. The P-51D incorporated lessons learned from combat operations and pilot feedback into what would become the definitive version of the aircraft. The most obvious change was the bubble canopy that replaced the earlier Razorback design. This gave pilots complete 360-degree visibility, a massive advantage in the fluid chaos of aerial combat, where spotting an enemy fighter a few seconds earlier often meant the difference between life and death. Pilots who flew both variants unanimously praised the improved visibility of the P-51D. But the changes went far beyond the canopy. The P-51D carried 6 Browning M 2.50 caliber machine guns instead of the 4 guns mounted in earlier models. These weren't just any machine guns. The Browning .50 caliber was one of the most effective aircraft weapons of World War II, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at 750 to 850 rounds per minute, with enough striking power to tear apart aircraft structures and detonate fuel tanks. The increased firepower came with a completely redesigned ammunition feed system that dramatically reduced gun jamming, one of the most frustrating problems pilots had experienced with earlier models. When a Mustang pilot squeezed the trigger in a P-51D, all 6 guns fired reliably, putting a devastating weight of fire onto the target. German pilots quickly learned that even a short burst from a P-51D's guns could be fatal. The P-51D also featured the K-14 gyroscopic gun sight, a sophisticated computing device that helped pilots lead moving targets. The gun sight calculated deflection automatically based on target range and angle, displaying a reticle that showed pilots exactly where to aim to hit a maneuvering enemy aircraft. Combined with the reliable 6-gun armament, this made the P-51D lethal in the hands of even moderately experienced pilots. Nearly 8,000 P-51D Mustangs were built, making it by far the most numerous variant. They began arriving in Europe in large numbers during the spring of 1944, just as the preparations for D-Day intensified. By the time Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the P-51D had become the primary long-range escort fighter of the United States Army Air Forces. The impact on the air war was measurable in stark statistics. In January 1944, before the arrival of long-range Mustang escorts, the 8th Air Force lost 223 heavy bombers on missions over Germany. By May 1944, with hundreds of P-51 Mustangs providing escort, bomber losses dropped to 156, despite flying more missions against more heavily defended targets. The trend continued throughout the summer and fall, but the losses that really told the story were on the German side. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging experienced pilots at unsustainable rates. Every major bomber raid now resulted in dogfights, where German fighters faced numerical disadvantage against better-equipped American fighters that could pursue them relentlessly. Luftwaffe pilot training programs couldn't replace losses fast enough, and the quality of replacement pilots declined steadily as experienced instructors were pulled into combat units. By the fall of 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force was effectively broken. German fighters still rose to defend the Reich when American bombers appeared, but they did so with diminishing effectiveness. Inexperienced pilots flew obsolescent aircraft with chronic fuel shortages against overwhelming numbers of technologically superior American fighters. The outcome of individual engagements was rarely in doubt. The P-51 Mustang hadn't just won air superiority over Germany. It had achieved something more significant. It had made the strategic bombing campaign viable by solving the escort range problem that had seemed mathematically impossible to overcome. Those B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators that previously flew unescorted through the gap of death now reached their targets with fighter protection, dropped their bombs with greater accuracy because they weren't being torn apart by fighter attacks, and returned home with acceptable loss rates. And it wasn't just about protecting bombers. Mustang pilots actively hunted the Luftwaffe wherever they could find it. They strafed airfields, destroyed aircraft on the ground, attacked training facilities, and made it impossible for German fighters to operate with the freedom they had enjoyed earlier in the war. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The final accounting of the P-51 Mustang's contribution to victory in Europe is staggering. Mustang pilots were credited with destroying approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. They destroyed another 4,131 aircraft on the ground during strafing attacks. Those numbers represent a substantial portion of total Luftwaffe losses during the final 18 months of the war. But the deeper significance went beyond kill counts. The P-51 Mustang proved that the strategic bombing doctrine, which many had dismissed as unworkable after the devastating losses of 1943, could succeed with the right supporting technology. It demonstrated that air superiority wasn't just about having good fighters. It was about having fighters that could go where they were needed and stay there long enough to accomplish the mission. The transformation from that dismissed low-altitude fighter to the weapon that broke German air superiority happened because engineers refused to accept that the laws of physics made long-range, high-altitude escort impossible. They found a solution by combining the Mustang's exceptional airframe design with Britain's superb Merlin engine. And they proved that sometimes the difference between a mediocre weapon and a war-winning one comes down to one critical change that transforms everything. When Oberleutnant Franz Stigler encountered that lone P-51 Mustang over Germany in February 1944, he was looking at an aircraft that would render his entire way of fighting obsolete within months. The Luftwaffe's tactical advantages, built through years of combat experience, would evaporate as hundreds and then thousands of these transformed fighters filled the skies over Europe. The hunters would become the hunted, and there would be nowhere left to hide. Today, the P-51 Mustang stands as perhaps the most iconic fighter aircraft of World War II, recognized instantly by aviation enthusiasts and historians worldwide. Its polished aluminum skin, bubble canopy, and distinctive profile represent not just technological achievement, but a turning point in military aviation history. Museums preserve these aircraft as flying monuments to the men who flew them and the engineers who created them. But the real legacy of the P-51 Mustang isn't in museums or air show performances. It's in the fundamental lesson the aircraft taught about warfare, technology, and the importance of solving the right problem. American military planners had committed to strategic bombing as their primary contribution to defeating Nazi Germany. When that strategy failed due to unsustainable bomber losses, they didn't abandon the approach. They identified the critical problem, escort range, and they solved it. The P-51 Mustang didn't win World War II by itself. No single weapon system does that. But it made victory possible by enabling the strategic bombing campaign that destroyed Germany's capacity to continue fighting. It gave American bombers the protection they needed to reach targets deep inside Germany and return home. It forced the Luftwaffe into a battle of attrition they couldn't win. And it demonstrated that sometimes the difference between defeat and victory comes down to recognizing what needs to change and having the courage to make it happen. Those German pilots who dismissed the early P-51A as just another mediocre American fighter weren't wrong based on the evidence available to them. The Allison-powered Mustang was indeed limited to low-altitude operations, but they failed to imagine that American and British engineers would transform that aircraft into something unprecedented. By the time 175 P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin in March 1944, the Luftwaffe was facing an opponent they had never encountered before, a fighter that could go anywhere, stay as long as necessary, and win almost every engagement it fought. The laughter stopped quickly after that, and by the time the war ended 15 months later, the P-51 Mustang had written its name into aviation history as the fighter that changed everything about how air power shaped the outcome of World War II.